The shower that changed everything. Jake slowly opened his eyes as the alarm buzzed again and again in the background, and his room was still dark, and the early morning sun had not yet climbed over the buildings outside, and his head felt heavy, and he did not want to leave his warm bed, but work was waiting and time was running. He dragged himself to the bathroom, still half asleep and not fully awake, and his eyes barely open as he stepped into the shower and turned the knob, and warm water poured down his back and steam rose all around him, and he closed his eyes and leaned his head against the wall, feeling the water wash away the tiles were old and had always been there since he moved into this apartment, and one of them always felt different, a little warmer than the rest, and today his fingers brushed over it again, and something clicked and a small blue light appeared under his hand, and at first he thought it was his imagination, but then the wall under his hand moved. He stepped back confused and watched as the tile pushed itself inward, and a soft humming noise began to fill the air, and the water stopped suddenly, and the lights in the bathroom flickered, and the mirror cracked right down the middle, and a strange blue mist began to rise from the shower floor. Jake stood frozen in shock and tried to step out of the shower, but his feet felt stuck to the floor, as if the tiles had turned into glue, and the mist became thicker, and he could not see anything clearly. And then a voice spoke, and it was not coming from outside, but inside his head. Voice was not human and not male or female, and it said, "Reproduction protocol activated, preparing host integration. Please remain calm." Jake screamed, but no sound came out, and he tried to fight whatever was happening, but it was useless, and the walls of the shower changed into a glowing chamber covered in moving symbols, and lines of light ran across the floor and up the walls, and the air became heavy and warm like a thick fog pressing against his skin. His heart was racing and his body was shaking, and the symbols began to float around him like small glowing insects, and they moved fast, circling him again and again, and then they shot into his skin one by one, and he felt a strange electric pulse every time one of them touched him. He felt a strange electric pulse every time one of them touched him, closed his eyes and tried to wake up, thinking this was just a bad dream or a hallucination. But it was real, and it was happening, and his body felt like it was no longer his own, and the mist entered his nose and mouth and eyes, and everything became bright and loud. And then suddenly it all stopped. The mist disappeared, and the lights faded, and the symbols vanished, and Jake collapsed to the floor with his heart pounding and his body wet and shaking, and everything around him looked normal again, as if nothing had happened. Water started again, and steam rose like before, and the cracked mirror was whole again, and the blue tile looked just like the others, and Jake gasped for air and pulled himself out of the shower and sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his hands on his face, trying to understand what just happened. He looked at his arm and saw strange lines glowing under his skin like tattoos, but they faded when he blinked, and when he touched the spot it felt normal. And his phone buzzed on the counter, and he reached for it. With a trembling hand, the screen was full of static, and then turned black, and then a new screen appeared with alien symbols, and then a face showed up, not human, and not anything he had seen in a movie or game, and the face looked straight at him and said, "You have activated the device, host compatibility confirmed." Jake dropped the phone and stumbled backward and stared at it with wide eyes, and the screen went blank again, and his heart was still racing, and his mind was full of questions and fear. Stood up slowly and looked around the bathroom, trying to find any clue or camera or speaker, but everything looked just like it did before, and he whispered to himself again and again, "What is happening to me?" As he stepped out of the bathroom, he did not notice that the small tile behind him was now pulsing softly with a blue light, like it was waiting for something or someone, and the air around it shimmered for a moment and then returned to stillness. Outside, the sky was clear and the world was moving as usual, but inside that small apartment, in that simple shower, something ancient had woken up, something not from Earth, and Jake had just become a part of it without knowing what it truly meant. Jake sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the glowing marks on his arm, while the rest of the world outside his window moved unlike nothing had happened, and his hands were shaking, and his heart still beating fast like a drum, and he kept asking himself again and again if he was going crazy or dreaming, or just very, very sick. The morning sunlight touched the floor, and the soft sound of cars and birds came from outside, but none of it felt real anymore, and everything in his life had changed in just a few minutes inside. A shower that now felt like a doorway to another world. He stood up slowly and walked back into the bathroom, and the air was still warm, as if something had passed through not long ago. And he reached for the same tile again, but now it looked normal, and there was no light and no sound and no sign of what had happened earlier, and he tapped it gently, but nothing moved. He took a deep breath and checked the mirror, and for a moment, he thought he saw something behind him, a shadow with long arms and bright blue eyes, but when he turned around, nothing was there, and only steam from his breath fogged the mirror, and the room was silent. Back in his room, he picked up his phone, and the screen was still black but buzzing softly like it had a heartbeat, and then the screen lit up and showed those same alien symbols again, spinning in circles and changing shape like they were alive and learning and trying to speak to him in a way he could understand. A soft voice came from the speaker, and it was the same voice he had heard inside his head in the shower, and it said, "Welcome, host. Your integration has begun, and your presence has been detected by off-world observers." Jake dropped the phone and backed away, slowly, his mouth open and eyes wide, and he did not know if he should scream or run or smash the phone with something heavy, but his body was frozen and his thoughts spinning like a storm inside his mind. Then the phone screen changed again and showed a face, this time more clear than before. It was a female figure, but not human. Her skin was silver and her eyes like stars, and her voice was calm and cold, and she said, "If you are seeing this message, then the reproduction device has accepted your DNA, and you are now the living key." Jake blinked and whispered the words again to himself, "the living key," and his voice trembled. And the screen continued showing images of glowing cities, strange symbols, and ships flying through blue skies far from Earth. And then she said, "Others will come for you, some to protect and some to use you, and you must not trust anyone without proof." Suddenly, a loud knock came at his door, and his heart skipped a beat, and he turned quickly, staring at the door without breathing, and the knock came again, this time louder, and followed by a voice that said, "Delivery for Jake, open up." He walked slowly to the door and looked through the peephole and saw a man in a delivery uniform holding a package, but something about his eyes felt wrong. They were too focused, too still, like they were watching more than seeing, and Jake felt a sharp pain in his head, like someone pressing into his brain from far away. He stepped back and did not open the door, and the man knocked one more time before walking away, but Jake watched through the window and saw him stop at the corner and talk into his watch and then disappear into a black car with no plates and tinted windows. Jake locked all his doors and closed the curtains and turned off all lights and sat in the corner of his room, breathing fast and trying to think and trying to understand what was happening and why. The phone buzzed again and now showed a map with a blinking red light moving closer to his location, and a message appeared that said, "Extraction Team en route, stay hidden and prepare for Phase 2. He picked up the phone with both hands and stared at the screen, and then the glowing lines on his arm lit up again, and he felt a rush of energy through his body, like a wave of electricity mixed with light and sound, and he could hear a new sound now, a soft humming from the bathroom growing louder every second. He turned his head slowly and saw the tile glowing again, and this time, the entire wall began to shift and change, and a small opening appeared with bright light inside, and he could see shapes moving beyond the wall like shadows of beings waiting for him to step in. Jake knew he had two choices: stay and be hunted, or enter and find the truth. And he took one last look at his room, the place where he had lived for years, and then walked slowly toward the light. As he stepped into the glowing space, the wall closed behind him, and silence returned to the apartment, as if nothing had ever happened, and the only sound was the wind moving past the windows, and the world outside continued without knowing that something very old and very powerful had just awakened again. The hallway was cold, and the lights flickered as Jake stepped through the strange opening, and behind him, the wall sealed itself without a sound, and he looked around at the space that did not belong to any building on Earth, and the air felt heavy. With energy and the walls pulsed like they were breathing, he moved forward slowly, and the floor lit up beneath each step with soft blue light, and ahead of him stood a round platform surrounded by floating shapes that looked like screens but had no edges and no buttons, and each one showed images of stars and strange ships and alien landscapes he could not understand. A voice echoed around him, and it was the same voice from before, and it said, "Welcome, host, your arrival has been confirmed. The observers are in motion, and your extraction has failed. Please remain calm." Jake blinked and tried to ask what this place was, and who the observers were, but the voice only repeated the same message, and then the screens all turned red and showed a glowing triangle symbol, and the room began to shake like an earthquake, and he felt something was coming closer fast. Suddenly, the ceiling opened above him, and a beam of white light pulled him upward through a tunnel of mist and strange symbols. And then he landed in a small room that looked like a control center with metal walls and strange chairs that moved on their own, and the windows showed the Earth far below like a blue ball in space. His breath caught in his throat, and he touched the window with his hand and whispered that this had to be a dream, but the cold glass and the deep silence around him told him it was all real, and nothing would ever be the same again. Then a new face appeared on a tall glowing panel in front of him, a humanoid figure wearing dark armor with sharp glowing lines across the chest and eyes that burned like fire, and the figure spoke directly into Jake's mind and said, "You carry the key to a dying race, and we will take it from you by force or by choice." Jake backed away and shouted for help, but no one came, and the panel turned off, and the room went dark, and the voice inside his head now sounded different, and it said, "They are coming. They know where you are, and they want the power inside you, and you must run now." Without thinking, Jake turned and ran through the hallway as lights flashed red and a loud alarm echoed around him, and doors opened and closed by themselves as he moved, and he felt like the walls were trying to guide him toward something or somewhere safe. A blast shook the ground, and he fell to the floor, and behind him, he saw part of the ship explode, and metal pieces flew past him, and fire filled the corridor, and from the smoke came a tall figure in black with glowing red eyes and long arms like metal blades, and it walked slowly toward Jake without making a sound. Jake crawled backward trying to get away, and suddenly a door opened to his right, and a hand pulled him inside and slammed the door shut, and a shield came down over it, and the room filled with blue light again, and standing in front of him was someone he had never seen before. It was a woman, but her skin was like glass, and her hair moved like water, and her eyes were deep gold, and she said, "I am not your enemy. I was sent by the last council of the Eldari to protect the genetic flame you now carry, and you must trust me if you want to live." Jake tried to speak, but only managed to ask, "Who are the Eldari, and what do they want with me?" And she answered, "They created the device long ago to preserve their kind, and you activated it by accident. But now it is part of you, and others want to use it for wars." She moved to a panel on the wall and touched it, and a large map appeared, showing dozens of ships moving across space and red marks blinking closer and closer to Earth. And she said, "The bounty clans have been hunting for the device for centuries, and now that you have it, they will never stop until they take it or you." Jake looked at the map and felt fear grow inside him like fire spreading through dry wood, and he said, "I do not want any of this. I am just a person. I was taking a shower, and now I am running from aliens and turning into something else." The woman nodded and said, "I know you did not choose this, but now the device has chosen you, and your DNA is the only one compatible with the Eldari seed. And if they get to you first, everything will be lost forever." A loud crash shook the room, and part of the ceiling cracked, and from above a red beam started cutting through the wall, and she grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him through a door that opened behind them, and they ran through a long hallway filled with strange machines and blue fog. As they reached The end of the hallway, a window opened, and they saw Earth again. But now it was covered in strange clouds, and multiple ships were entering the atmosphere. And the woman said, "They are coming, and we have very little time." Jake looked at the sky, and then at his arm where the glowing marks had returned brighter than ever, and he knew the next decision he made could change the future of more than just his world, and somewhere deep in space more eyes had turned toward Earth, and more hands were reaching for the key that Jake never asked for, but now carried inside him with no way to give it back. The ship moved through the dark space like a silent ghost, while Jake sat near a curved window watching stars pass like falling snow, and his mind felt heavy, like it carried too much weight and too many questions that had no answers, and every breath felt like a step into something deeper and more strange. Beside him stood the alien woman who had saved him, and she looked at the stars with quiet eyes and said nothing for a long time, and then she finally spoke with a voice soft and calm, and told him her name was Solara, and she was the last genetic guide of the Eldari race. Jake turned toward her and asked what the Eldari really were and why they had chosen him, and Solara walked to the center of the room where a platform rose from the floor and lights circled above her head like moons, and she said the Eldari were once the rulers of light and knowledge across 1,000 galaxies, and their bodies were made from energy and flesh and memory, and their minds were open to all living things. She looked at Jake with eyes that glowed like suns behind glass, and said when their world began to die, they built a device, a living code that could mix with other life and restart their bloodline in a new form. And that device was hidden long ago on a world forgotten by stars and known to no one. Jake felt the truth press against his chest like a storm building, and he asked how it ended up in a shower in his apartment. And Solara answered that Earth was once visited by the first explorers of the Eldari, long before humans could speak, and when war broke out among the stars, the device was sealed and left behind to be safe. Now it had awakened again because it had found a match, and Jake was that match, and his DNA held the one missing strand that allowed the seed to grow again. And Solara said he was not changing into something else, but becoming something more. Jake looked down at his hands and saw the faint blue lines beneath his skin pulse, with quiet light like a second heartbeat, and he asked what it meant for him and for Earth. And Solara said others would come. Not just bounty hunters, but rulers and rebels who wanted the Eldari rebirth for power and for control. She led him down a corridor into a chamber filled with floating crystals, each one showing a memory of her people, and she waved her hand over one, and it showed an image of the Eldari in there. True form, tall and radiant beings with wings of light and voices that shaped the stars. And Jake saw how beautiful and powerful they were, and how the war had broken them. Another crystal showed a child, a glowing figure, running through fields of silver grass, and Solara said that child was the last natural-born Eldari before the fall, and that child was now gone, and so were all the others, and Jake was the only one who could bring back the hope they had lost. Jake felt a sharp pain in his head and fell to one knee, and his vision filled with symbols and light. And then he saw a memory that was not his, a world burning, ships falling from the sky, and a great voice crying for help, and then silence and darkness, and the feeling of being left behind. Solara helped him up and said the device was now sharing the core of the Eldari soul with him, and that it would sometimes show him the past because he was no longer only human, and he had to carry their memories to guide the future. She brought him to a table where a thin metal band rested, and said this was the neural ring, and once placed on the head, it would show the full map of the genetic code now growing inside him, and help him understand how to control it before it controlled him. Jake placed the ring on his head, and the room vanished around him, and he was standing in a field of stars, and before him stood a figure of light, shaped like himself, but older and calmer. And this figure said, "You are now the flame bearer, and the path ahead is yours to build or destroy." He reached out to touch the figure, but it faded into mist, and the stars turned into a map showing thousands of points, and each one represented a possible future, and some were full of life and others were nothing but ash and smoke. When he removed the ring, he was sweating and shaking, and Solara said his mind had touched the root of their creation, and now the seed inside him had bonded fully, and there was no going back. Suddenly the ship shook, and alarms echoed through the walls, and Solara's face grew tense, and she said they had been found again, and this time it was not a hunter or a drone, but a battlecruiser from the Zarnith Coalition, a race known for breaking planets and capturing living weapons. Jake stood, and the light under his skin became brighter and faster, and Solara looked at him and said, "The device is responding to danger, and now you must decide if you will run again or stand and fight, because the DNA of the gods flows through you now, and the universe will follow the choice you make in that moment." Jake no longer felt small or afraid. He felt like the center of something ancient and powerful, and he stepped toward the command panel and said, "Show me where they are." "I am ready." The stars outside the window no longer looked peaceful and calm as Jake stood at the command panel and watched the Zarnith battlecruiser move closer like a giant blade cutting through space, and Solara stood beside him with her hands glowing as she sent signals across the ship's systems, and her voice steady but faster now, and she said the shields would not last long against a direct hit. Jake could feel the energy moving through his body faster than before, and the glowing lines on his arms now reached up to his neck, and he touched the panel with both hands, and the ship responded with new lights and pathways opening, like the ship itself was listening to him, looked at him and said the device was starting to merge with the ship's core, and soon he would be able to command it, not just with thoughts, but with intention and feeling. And then she paused, and her face changed like she had just realized something she did not expect. Jake asked her what was wrong, and she said the signal the Zarnith were using to track them was not coming from the cruiser, but from inside their own ship, and that meant someone had betrayed them from within. Before Jake could respond, the door behind them opened, and a tall figure entered with long arms and silver armor, and his eyes were black like endless tunnels, and he smiled in a way that felt sharp and cold, and said, "It is nothing personal, host, but the council has decided that the seed must not remain in your hand." Solara stepped in front of Jake and raised her hand, and light formed a shield between them. But the figure spoke again and said, "Your kind was supposed to guide, not protect, and the device was meant for control, not rebirth." And he reached into his chest and pulled out a small sphere pulsing with red light. Jake felt pain in his head, again like a knife turning, and he dropped to his knees as the sphere glowed brighter, and Solara shouted that the signal was corrupting the seed, and that he needed to fight it with thought and memory. And he closed his eyes and focused on one thing he knew was his and only his. Remembered the sound of rain on his old roof, and the smell of coffee in the morning, and the way the sunlight touched the plants in his window. And slowly the pain faded, and the glowing marks on his skin pushed the red signal away like fire burning through ice. He stood up again, and his eyes were glowing now with blue light, and the figure stepped back in surprise, and Jake said, "You do not get to decide who I am or what I carry." And he reached forward, and the ship's walls responded, and pulled the traitor backward into a sealed chamber that locked with a sound like thunder. Solara dropped the shield and looked at Jake with something like pride, and said the bond was complete now, and the device was protecting itself through him, and he had just passed the first trial of will. Jake asked what the next trial was, and she said choice was the next and hardest test, because the ship had detected a nearby station orbiting a dead moon where a rebel group had taken control of ancient Eldari technology, and they were using it to create hybrid soldiers made from stolen DNA and twisted light. She said the council wanted them destroyed, but there was another option, and Jake could go there and shut the system down peacefully if he could connect to the tech with the bond he now held, and his choice would decide what kind of protector he would become. The ship changed course, and in a few hours they reached the dark moon, and the station came into view like a giant broken wheel turning slowly in silence, and Jake could feel something inside calling to him like a forgotten voice whispering through the walls. They landed on the outer deck and moved through long corridors filled with wires and humming machines, Solara warned that the rebels would try to convince him that they were the true heirs of the Eldari and that their way was the only way, but he had to listen with his own heart, not just with his ears inside. The central chamber, they found the core, a glowing sphere larger than a house surrounded by tubes, filled with floating forms, part human and part something else and standing. Near the core was a woman with silver eyes and a voice like music who said, "Welcome, brother, you are late, but you are still in time to join the real future." Jake asked her what she meant, and she said the rebirth should not be pure but strong, and to survive in this galaxy, the new Eldari must be weapon, not wisdom, and she offered her hand and showed him the path to power and control and endless reach across the stars. Solara said nothing and stepped back, letting him choose, and the room waited in silence, and the floating forms turned slowly in their tubes, and the core pulsed like a waiting heart. Jake looked at the hand and then at Solara and then at his own reflection in the glass and saw something new in his eyes, something both human and not, and he knew the choice was not just his, but for every future that might come after. Turned away from the woman and walked to the core and placed his hands on it and filled it with memory, not of war but of home, and the core shifted and glowed blue and the tubes melted away and the station began to shut down on its own. The woman screamed and vanished and the power faded, and Jake stood in the light as Solara said the second trial was over and the flame had chosen the path of life, not fear. The stars seemed to grow darker as the ship passed through the edge of the ancient veil that surrounded the Lost Quadrant, where the homeworld of the Eldari had once lived and breathed, and Solara stood at the front with her eyes closed and her hands resting over her heart while Jake watched the strange currents in space flowing like rivers of glowing threads. Path ahead was not marked by any map, and the ship was guided not by machines, but by memory and blood, and the deep connection that now lived inside Jake. And Solara whispered that the planet had hidden itself from time itself, and only the flame within him could call it back into the light. Jake placed his hand on the command pillar and felt the ship respond like a living thing, and the stars around them bent and shifted, and then the veil parted, and in front of them floated a broken world surrounded by fragments of moons and light storms and long trails of glowing mist that looked like the remains of forgotten dreams. Solara opened her eyes and spoke with a voice full of sorrow and reverence, and said, "Welcome to Elthar, the first cradle of the Eldari, and the last breath of their memory." And Jake looked at the shattered surface below, where once great cities had stood tall with spires made of crystal and thought, and now only ruins remained. The ship landed in silence upon a flat platform, overgrown with vines that shimmered with strange colors, and Solara stepped out first, her feet touching the ground as if meeting an old friend, and Jake followed her, his body feeling heavier, as if the planet itself was remembering him through the seed he carried. They walked through the ruins and past statues covered in dust and cracks, and faces that looked both human and divine, and the silence was deep but not empty, and every step seemed to echo through time, like the world was listening and watching and waiting for something to return. Solara led him to the center of what had once been the Hall of Flame, where the Eldari had gathered to share memory and guide the stars, and now only a circle of broken pillars remained with vines growing over the stones, and a single blue flame still burning in the air, untouched by wind or time. She said this flame was the last echo of their people, held alive by the will of the creators, and it would only speak to one who bore the living key. And she told Jake to step into the circle and let the flame see him and choose him if he was truly ready. Jake moved forward slowly, and the flame responded by rising higher and turning a deeper blue, and then it reached out like a hand and touched his chest, and in that moment everything around him vanished, and he was pulled into the memory of the world itself. He saw the birth of stars and the rise of the Eldari and their beauty and knowledge, and then he saw the war that tore the galaxy apart, and how the Eldari refused to become weapons and chose to vanish rather than fall. And he saw the first guardian seal the seed and send it to a young planet full of chaos and hope. Jake fell to his knees as the memory passed through him like a wave of fire and light, and Solara knelt beside him and said the world had accepted him, and now he was bound not just by DNA, but by spirit and legacy, and his choices would shape the future of both humans and Elder. Suddenly the ground shook and the sky above cracked with red light, and Solara looked up with fear and said the veil had been broken and someone else had followed them, and before she could finish her words, a ship appeared over the ruins, dark and sharp like a blade of night. The ship dropped figures in black armor, who landed with weapons drawn, and they moved toward the circle without speaking, and Jake stood between them and the flame and raised his hand, and the symbols on his skin glowed brighter than ever before, and the attackers paused, unsure and waiting for a command. Then a new voice spoke from the ship, and a figure stepped down wearing robes woven from darkness and light, and his eyes were silver and filled with cold purpose, and he said, "I am Corrine, last son of the outer flame, and I claim the legacy for a new order." Solara stood beside Jake and whispered that Corrine had once been a protector like her, but he had turned away from peace and wanted to use the seed to rebuild the Eldari as conquerors, not guides, and his presence here meant that war had come to the homeworld once again. Corrine raised his hand and the air cracked with energy, and he said, "You have a choice, young one. Join me, and we will reshape the stars, or stand against me and be erased like the old ways that failed to survive." Jake looked at him, and then at the blue flame, and then at Solara, and he saw the pain in her eyes and the hope that she still carried like a fragile thread, and he knew this was not just about survival anymore, but about what kind of future should rise. From the ashes he stepped forward and said nothing, but his body answered, and the ground lit up with the same patterns that once filled the skies of this world, and the flame rose behind him like a shield of memory, and Corrine's soldiers backed away with fear in their eyes. Corrine shouted in rage, and the sky split as his ship powered up its weapons, and Solara said, "We must leave now and return to the stars where the final choice can be made." And Jake nodded and touched the flame one last time, and it whispered to him in a voice like wind through leaves, and then it vanished into his chest. Ship rose again, and behind them the world began to fade once more into the veil, and Jake knew that the end was near, and the next battle would not be about who had power, but about who deserved to shape the meaning of that power and what it meant to be alive. The stars looked like silent witnesses as the ship moved away from the fading homeworld, and Jake stood near the viewing dome with Solara beside him, and her face calm, but her eyes filled with deep sadness and fierce hope, and behind them the last blue light of Ulthur vanished into the folds of space like a dream lost to time. Jake felt the presence of the flame inside him, stronger than ever, and it was no longer just light or memory, but something living that breathed with him and responded to his thoughts and fears, and it whispered without words, telling him the choice was close and the path ahead would not wait. Solara placed a small crystal on the console, and the room around them changed into a map of stars and signals and warships, and all across the galaxy small red sparks were spreading like fire through dry fields, and she said Corran had already sent his message to the broken factions of the galaxy and promised them a new empire built on the reborn power of the Eldari flame. Jake looked at the spreading red, and then at the few blue points that still blinked faintly, and Solara said those were the last peaceful enclaves, the few that still believed in balance and healing, and they would all fall if the seed was used for conquest instead of harmony. The ship reached the edge of a large sector, where old battles had left debris floating like scars across the sky, and in the center of that field hovered a structure older than most stars, and shaped like a ring of shattered stone and light. And Solara said this was the Axis Core, the place where all flame carriers must make the final choice. As they approached, the gate opened like an eye and allowed them inside, and the ship docked near a circular platform surrounded by ancient machines, covered in vines and symbols, and some still glowing softly, as if waiting for this moment to return. Jake stepped out, and the flame inside him responded to the place like it remembered every stone and every echo, and Solara guided him to the center where a raised platform waited with two paths, carved into the floor, one glowing red and the other blue. And above them hovered a sphere of pure light. She said the flame could only be released here. Once fully awakened, and once it left his body, it would take form based on his final choice, and that form would become the future of all Eldari bloodlines. And whatever new race came after, before Jake could speak, the sound of engines filled the air, and a black ship descended on the far edge of the platform, and Corrin stepped out with two warriors behind him, and his voice was calm and sharp as he said, "It is time, young one. The galaxy is ready to rise again, and you can be its spark or its shadow." Solara moved to speak, but Jake raised his hand and stepped forward, and he looked at Corrin and said, "You want the power to control others, but you never asked what the flame wants, and maybe you forgot that it remembers everything, including the pain of being used and broken." Corrin laughed and said, "Memory is not strength, and mercy is not survival." And then he pointed to the red path and said, "Choose that, and you will never be hunted again, and you will never be weak, and the stars will know your name as the one who brought fire back to the void." Jake turned and looked at the blue path and felt warmth rise from it, like the feeling of home after a long storm, and he saw images in his mind of children running through golden fields and cities filled with both humans and Eldari living together, and he knew the blue path would be harder, but it would also be real. He closed his eyes and remembered his small apartment, his old shower, the first light, the fear, the wonder, the first time he heard Solara's voice, and the moment he realized he was part of something much bigger than his own life, and he opened his eyes and stepped onto the blue path without hesitation. The platform began to glow, and the sphere above them responded with a bright pulse, and then the light entered Jake's body and rose from his chest in a stream of blue and silver and gold, and it wrapped around the chamber like a soft wind carrying forgotten songs. Corrin shouted in anger and tried to reach the platform, but Solara blocked him with a wall of light, and the machines around them awakened, and the ring above the chamber lit up with a new symbol, never seen before, a symbol that combined the Eldari spiral and the human spiral into one. The flame released its final pulse and spread across the stars, not as a weapon but as a signal of rebirth, and everywhere it touched, old machines stopped attacking. Seeds of war melted into light, and those who had followed Corrin began to feel doubt where once there was Raga. Corrin fell to his knees and vanished into shadow and silence, and Jake stood at the center of the chamber, now calm and steady, and Solara walked to him and said, "You did not just choose a path, you created a new one, and now the galaxy has a chance to heal." Jake looked up at the stars and saw them not as distant or empty, but full of voices and chances, and he knew he would never go back to his old life, but he would carry its memory as the compass for what came next. And somewhere across a quiet green hill, a small child with glowing eyes looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Father," as a new sun rose over a world finally ready to begin again.